In the charming town of Willowbrook, life moved at a gentle pace. The town was known for its beautiful gardens, friendly neighbors, and most of all, its famous bakery, the Sweet Haven. The bakery, nestled in the heart of the town, was owned by Mrs. Eleanor Bennet. She was a kind, elderly woman with a twinkle in her eye and a love for baking. Mrs. Bennet's pastries were the best in the county. People came from nearby towns just to taste her cakes, cookies, and pies. But there was one item that stood out above all: the legendary chocolate chip cookies. These cookies were perfect in every way, crispy on the outside, chewy on the inside, with just the right amount of chocolate. No one could resist them. One sunny morning, as the town was waking up, a young girl named Lily walked into the Sweet Haven. Lily was 10 years old, with curly brown hair and a big smile. She loved to bake and dreamed of becoming a famous baker like Mrs. Bennet. "Good morning, Mrs. Bennet," Lily said cheerfully. "Good morning, Lily," Mrs. Bennet replied with a warm smile. "What can I get for you today?" "I was hoping to get some of your famous chocolate chip cookies," Lily said. "They're my favorite." Mrs. Bennet laughed and handed her a small bag of cookies. "Here you go, dear. Enjoy." Lily thanked her and left the bakery, savoring the delicious cookies as she walked home. She thought about how wonderful it would be to make cookies just like Mrs. Bennet's. She decided that she would try to find out the secret recipe. The next day, Lily returned to the bakery with a plan. She offered to help Mrs. Bennet with the baking, hoping to learn the secret recipe. Mrs. Bennet was happy to have an eager helper and welcomed her into the kitchen. For weeks, Lily helped Mrs. Bennet in the bakery. She learned how to make cakes, pies, and other treats. But every time Mrs. Bennet made the chocolate chip cookies, she did it alone, behind a closed door. Lily's curiosity grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, after the bakery had closed, Lily decided to stay behind and find the secret recipe. She waited until Mrs. Bennet went upstairs to her living quarters. Then, she quietly crept into the kitchen and started searching. She looked through the cupboards, drawers, and shelves, but she couldn't find anything. Just as she was about to give up, she noticed a small, locked box on a high shelf. "That must be where the secret recipe is," she thought. Determined to find out, she climbed onto a stool and reached for the box. As she pulled it down, it slipped from her hands and fell to the floor with a loud crash. Mrs. Bennet heard the noise and rushed downstairs. She found Lily standing next to the broken box, looking guilty and sad. "Lily, what are you doing?" Mrs. Bennet asked gently. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Bennet," Lily said, tears filling her eyes. "I just wanted to know the secret recipe for your chocolate chip cookies. I didn't mean to break anything." Mrs. Bennet looked at Lily and saw how much she cared. She sighed and sat down, motioning for Lily to sit next to her. "Lily, my dear," Mrs. Bennet said softly, "the secret recipe is not in that box. The recipe is special, but it's not just about the ingredients. It's about the love and care that goes into making them. I've been making these cookies for many years, and each time, I put my heart into them." Lily listened carefully, understanding what Mrs. Bennet was trying to say. "The secret is not just in the recipe," Mrs. Bennet continued. It's in the way you make them, with patience, love, and joy. That's what makes them so special. Lily nodded, feeling a sense of warmth and understanding. She realized that baking wasn't just about following a recipe, it was about the passion and care you put into it. Mrs. Bennet smiled and said, "How about we make a batch of cookies together? I'll show you everything." Lily's face lit up with excitement. "Really? Thank you, Mrs. Bennet." They spent the next few hours baking the famous chocolate chip cookies. Mrs. Bennet showed Lily every step, from mixing the dough to adding the chocolate chips and baking them to perfection. Lily watched closely, learning not just the recipe, but also the special touch that made the cookies so wonderful. As they baked, Mrs. Bennet shared stories about her life, how she started the bakery, and her love for baking. Lily felt honored to hear these stories and appreciated the time they spent together. When the cookies were done, they tasted them together. Lily could taste the difference. The cookies were even more delicious because of the love and care they had put into making them. From that day on, Lily continued to help Mrs. Bennet in the bakery. She learned more about baking and grew more confident in her skills. She also learned an important lesson: the true secret to great baking was not just in the ingredients, but in the love and joy you put into it. Years passed, and Lily grew up. She became a talented baker, known for her delicious treats. She eventually took over the Sweet Haven when Mrs. Bennet retired. Lily kept the tradition alive, making the famous chocolate chip cookies with the same love and care that Mrs. Bennet had taught her. The bakery remained a beloved place in Willowbrook, bringing joy to everyone who visited. And every time someone asked Lily for the secret recipe to her amazing cookies, she would smile and say, "It's made with love and care, that's the real secret." And so, in the charming town of Willowbrook, the legacy of the Sweet Haven continued, thanks to the bond between a young girl and a kind old baker, and the timeless secret of baking with love.